kind of for good reason that people have a little bit of trouble identifying Georgia on the map. I mean, one, it's a small country. It's about the size of West Virginia. It's quite small. It's very mountainous, like West Virginia. It's shaped like a wedge, and it borders the Black Sea, and above it is Russia, and to the east of it is Azerbaijan. To the south of it is Armenia and Turkey. So it's in a part of the world that's not clearly Europe and it's not clearly Asia. And it was in around 1800 essentially subsumed into the Russian Empire and remained a part of Russia from 1800 until 1991, with a few years here and there of semi-independence, right around World War I. So Georgia has been part of Russia for hundreds of years, and it's always been a crossroads. It's been a waypoint in the Silk Route. Anybody who wants to go from China and get to Europe, into the markets of the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire, they always had to go through Georgia. So at moments it was controlled by the Persians and by the Armenians and by the Russians and by the Ottomans for a long time. If you look at that part of the world, that it'll immediately make sense that this was a waypoint in the journey from Europe to Asia and Asia to Europe. Anyway, Georgia has had a history. It depends on how you really want to think about it. Like, it adopted Christianity in 327 AD. I probably got that right. So it's had more than 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years of continuous identity as a Christian nation. When I say nation, I mean that in the sense of a people united by a language and a heritage that they recognize, a common historical path. But like, let's face it, you go all the way back to the Neolithic period and identify distinctly Georgian cultures that existed on that semi-peninsula between the Caspian, the Black Sea, the Pontic Steppe, and the Adriatic and Mediterranean. So in a way, Georgia has, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years of continuous history. Anyway, hinkali, which are the Georgian dumpling, they look a lot like other dumplings that are served in Eastern Europe and in the Slavic world, except for I think they're much larger. And it's interesting, like hinkali, and I'm going to say something that maybe gets me in trouble with my Georgian friends, but Georgians all think that hinkali are Georgian. Russians all think that hinkali are Georgian. And in fact, it's actually more complicated. Hinkali come from the mountainous region that is shared between Russia and Georgia in the Upper Caucasus, arguably from a region called Tusheti, which is incredibly mountainous, and it's kind of like the other side of Chechnya. If you look at the map, where you see Chechnya in Russia, directly across the border from there is a region called Tusheti, and it is one of the very few nomadic regions of Georgia. By and large, you can go all over Georgia and never see nomads, and the only place that you really find nomads is in this Upper Caucasus mountain region that between Russia and Georgia, and they practice what's called transhumanism. They go up and down the mountains of the Caucasus in Georgia, and they herd by and large sheep, and they follow the grass up the side of the mountain. So at the very early spring, the grass is abundant. The clover and the sweetgrass is abundant in the prairies at the bottom of the Caucasus, and then over the course of the summer and the fall, they follow the grass up the side of the mountains until it gets too cold, and then they come back down. Anyway, these people who are pastoralists, the Tush, probably they invented these hinkali So they're not actually Georgian, they're not Russian. They come from the Caucasus, and in a lot of ways they're an expression of this this herding, shepherding lifestyle. If you think about dumplings generally, they're marvels of simplicity. All it is flour, water, and meat and salt. It's things that you can always have, right? I mean, like you're traveling with meat on the hoof. You can keep flour and salt good for years. It never goes bad. And you can always find some fresh water. And if you have those ingredients, I mean, that's all. That's literally the only ingredients that go in classic hinkali. And so I got together a few days ago with Stetson students and faculty and my family, and we made hinkali. We made two versions. We made the traditional meat version, which is essentially nothing but chopped up onions, salt, pepper, lamb, wrapped in a dough made from flour and water and boiled and eaten with salt and pepper. That's the traditional hinkali preparation, and traditionally that's always eaten with beer. It's the only dish I know of in the Georgian culinary canon that is intentionally prepared for beer. So sort of the classic way to eat hinkali is to go to a restaurant. Every small village in Georgia has a hinkali, and you order a bunch of hinkali and you drink a bunch of beer, and you make an evening of it. So we made these traditional meat hinkali, but I also developed a vegan version of the filling that involves very, very essential, authentic Georgian flavors, but not in a way that I think would normally arise in Georgia itself. So I made a filling for these hinkali out of winter squash, garlic, walnuts, and tarragon. Those are all very, very essential components of any Georgian dish, and I just mixed them up and made them into a filling for these hinkali, and we prepared them exactly the same as the meat hinkali. I roasted this squash and the garlic, and I made a mashed filling, and we put that filling in a wrapper made from really super simple flour and water. The recipe is so simple. It's 3 cups of flour and just enough water so that you can make a pliable, elastic dough, and that makes about 24 hinkali. And so that's what we did, and we boiled them up and we ate them all together, and they were delicious, both the meat version and the vegan. And since I'm writing this cookbook, co-authoring this cookbook with this woman, Tinatin Mujavanaadze, who released this book called Gruzia Safkusam, I don't know, about 10 years ago. It's an excellent compendium of classic Georgian recipes, more or less for the Russian audience. Georgians don't need a cookbook to tell them how to cook Georgian food, because all Georgians know their Georgian cuisine. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but that's sort of the explanation that most Georgians would give. Moreover, there are only maybe, like, if you're being generous, 4 million Georgian speakers in the world. So Tinatin Mujavanaadze wrote this cookbook in Russian for Russians, because especially for the citizens of the Soviet Union, Georgia represented this very exotic, very spicy, rich culinary heritage. So I guess the analogy would be something like what France is to America: fancy, special, difficult, slightly exotic. Georgia is to the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, the Slavic nations that made up the Soviet Union. So Georgian cuisine had a really special place, and to this day you can go to Russian neighborhoods all over the world, in Jerusalem, in Brooklyn, in LA, in Miami, in Bonn, in Berlin, in Paris, and all of the Russians cook Georgian food. The quintessential post-Soviet dish is called lobio, which is a Georgian preparation, beans, and I think every post-Soviet eats lobio a few times a month. Georgian cuisine just became part of the Soviet culinary landscape. Anyway, So this makes sense now that Tina, my Georgian friend who lives in Tbilisi, wrote a cookbook of Georgian recipes for a Russian-speaking audience, and she called this cookbook Georgia with Taste, Gruzia со вкусом, and then she named the most popular dishes, lobio satsivi and khachapuri. That's the name of the book, and those are the dishes that every post-Soviet Russian speaking citizen would recognize as being distinctly Georgian. Khachapuri, which is sort of the quintessential famous dish from Georgia, which is eggy, cheesy bread. Satsivi, which nobody in the United States eats, but that is considered high cuisine in the post-Soviet world. That's turkey or chicken cooked in a walnut sauce. And lobio, this is the bean dish I mentioned a couple minutes ago. Anyway, this cookbook, written in Russian, excellent overview of Georgian cuisine, and I discovered it, I don't know, many years ago, long before I met Tina, and I admired it, and I thought, like, wow, this would be a great way to introduce the Western world, American world, the Brits, the Canadians, and the Americans, introduce them to Georgian cuisine. I met her in Tbilisi, and she said, translate my cookbook. Turns out that you can't really translate cookbooks. There's a lot of adaptation that had to go on. That cookbook, interesting, is so if you talk to most post-Soviets, when they think of Georgian food, they think of meat. And, you know, Georgia's got a great meat cuisine, like a lot of roasted meats and a lot of stews that Georgians are very proud of, and they would identify as being essential components of the Georgian cuisine. But it's interesting for a lot of different reasons. Georgian cuisine exists sort of in two different spheres. There's a very vegetarian and vegetable side of Georgian cooking, and there's a very meat orientation to Georgian cooking. There's actually a historical explanation for that. There's lots of historical explanations for that. One, you know, Georgia has always been an agricultural country throughout its entire history. The people they've been very close to the land, and there's a great, rich, and very present culture of dooryard fruits and vegetables and gardening. And like Georgians can't imagine a meal without lots and lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. The other reason that Georgia has developed a vegetarian cuisine is that many Georgians are very observant Georgian Orthodox, and there are 100 days of fasting in the Georgian tradition, in the Georgian Orthodox tradition, where Georgians can't eat meat, and they can't often eat milk products or eggs. So there are about 100 days in the Georgian Orthodox calendar that are vegetarian or vegan. In fact, really Orthodox Georgian practitioners, Orthodox practitioners, will not eat meat or any animal products on Wednesdays and Fridays. Concomitant with this great tradition of meat cuisine, there's always been a very vivid, active, vital vegetarian version of all of the dishes in the Georgian culinary canon, and that makes perfect sense. If you run a restaurant that specializes in hinkali, which are very much so a meat dish, they're traditionally filled with lamb or pork or beef. You can't cater to a majority Orthodox population that doesn't eat meat on Wednesdays and Fridays and keep your restaurant open. And so naturally, you develop all sorts of vegetarian and vegan versions of the dishes. So I took this cookbook that has that is meat and vegetables, and I basically peeled out all the vegetarian and vegan recipes from it. And I also adapted some of the meat dishes to vegetarian and vegan diets. And so this is what I did with these hinkali. Again, this is this misperception that Georgian food is meat oriented, and I think it's a misperception that Russians have, because Russians go to Georgian restaurants all over Russia. Like every corner has a like a Tex-Mex is here, Georgian is there. It's like every town has a Georgian restaurant, and every big city has a Georgian restaurant on every corner. And like you go and you eat meat. But that's not at all what Georgian supras are like. That's not at all what a Georgian like feast meal is. I have been to so many big feasts where there are 15 or 20 people around a table, and they stack dishes in Georgia, and all of the dishes are essentially vegetarian, vegan dishes, except for one. On the top of it, they put like a chicken stew or something like that, and it's literally one chicken chopped up into little pieces for 12 or 13 people, and that's all the meat they eat. And then for dessert, you eat fruit. So there's something like essentially natural and simple and raw. We talk a lot about superfoods in America, and when I mention this concept to the Georgians, and I say, well, yeah, like red peppers and garlic and nuts, those are all considered superfoods, and they look at me and they're like, what else would you eat? So I'll end this conversation by pointing out that for me, like real Georgian home cooking, my favorite Georgian dish, what I'll make myself in preference to just about anything, is a big bowl of gomi, which is for all intents and purposes polenta. It's slightly different, and in this cookbook that I've finished translating and is now in production, I call it Lobio, the vegetarian cooking of Georgia. I have a long explanation and a history of Georgia's love of all things corn. Anyway, so for me, like the sine qua non of Georgian cooking is a big bowl of gomi, of polenta, of grits, with a walnut sauce called baje. It's a garlicky, cilantro-heavy, hot pepper-laden walnut sauce poured on top, which is weird, right? So imagine like a gravy on top of polenta, but that's what it looks like. And I'll end this with an interesting observation about the classic Georgian meal of gomi, polenta, baje, walnut sauce, and pickled red cabbage. It represents a confluence of three of the most important, not the most important, but three very important traits that undergird all of Georgian cooking. So first of all, you have corn, which is, Georgians insist that they invented corn, that corn somehow arose in Georgia. Of course, we know that's not true. Corn is a New World vegetable, and it couldn't possibly have been introduced into Georgia before the 16th century. It's probably more like the 17th century. So on the one hand, you have Georgia's openness to new culinary traditions and the tendency to remake dishes and rethink dishes and to make them Georgian even though they aren't Georgian. So they've adopted this New World corn and made the essential home cooking dish of gomi. You ladle on top of this baje, which is made essentially from walnuts, spices, garlic, cilantro. And for me, one of the essential traits of Georgian cooking, one of the characteristic ingredients in Georgian cooking is nuts. And that has to do with the fact that Georgian cooking relies heavily on arboreal products generally. Honey, janjoli, which is the stamens of a tree that are pickled and eaten extensively in Georgia. Mushrooms, like the Georgians eat more mushrooms than any culture I've ever met, and then tree nuts. And so there's something very, very Georgian about the idea of going out into the woods and picking hazelnuts and walnuts, which are everywhere that you look in Georgia, in the plentiful woods all over the basin that makes up the center of Georgia. So you have this New World that is the New World with the twist, gomi, the polenta. You have the baje, which is this walnut sauce, which sort of embodies Georgia and its essential relationship with the land. And then you have what is, for me, an essentially Russian or Slavic influence. Like the Russians, the Slavic people managed to succeed 1,000 years ago in an area that no one else had managed to succeed in. These these coniferous forests of central and northern Russia, because they managed to adapt agriculturally to these areas. They developed crops and ways of eating and dishes that allowed them to survive in biomes and areas that no one else had managed to survive in. And one of the essential Slavic tricks is fermentation, and maybe the essential vegetable of Russia and Ukraine and Belarus is cabbage. And so you have this purple cabbage that's fermented. It's very, very Slavic. I'm sure that the Georgians always made it. I'm sure that the Georgians came up with it first. I'm sure that the Russians did not give, pickled cabbage to the Georgians. I don't want to offend the Georgian people, but it's a very Russian thing. The incredibly arboreal Georgian autochthonous original walnut sauce, and then this new world introduction of corn. And so in this one dish that Georgians think of as being essentially Georgian, as identifiably, absolutely, characteristically Georgian, what you actually see is the confluence of three different geographical, historical influences coming together in a bowl.